Well, good afternoon, folks. We're really pleased that you're joining us here this afternoon. We have a very interesting guest that has been, as they say on the street, rode hard and put up wet, okay? And she has she's had some seriously difficult problems, but she's going to tell us how she fought her way out of a very difficult set of life circumstances, including, and this is an important one because a lot of this is going to be about brain injury. And she's going to talk in great detail about traumatic growth experiences. You know, what happens is we're so interested in post-traumatic stress disorder, but she's talking about post-traumatic growth. And she's had a number of different traumas. Heidi, I should have really gotten the pronunciation of your name first. I know it's Heidi. Is it Siefkas?
Correct.
I got it.
Spot on.
Okay. So Heidi, where are you from now?
I'm originally from a small town in Wisconsin, but I now call two places home. South Florida, where I am talking to you, as well as the sunny island of Kauai.
Yes, we're not jealous.
I had a feeling you would be not so sympathetic to those two places.
No, it's great. You got two beautiful parts of the world. And let's talk a little more about what exactly was the traumatic event that changed your life, Heidi. Could you tell us about it?
Press rewind to the fall of 2009. At that point in time, I was living in South Florida, but I was living a very different and busy career. I was juggling a lot of balls. A VP of the travel industry, so I was globetrotting from Berlin one week to LA the next, taking a red eye back to Orlando for an expo. I was happily married to a Brazilian chef, a homeowner, keeping up with the Joneses here in South Florida, and very healthy. Then on one of those travels, I ended up in the Northeast, in Hudson River Valley, New York, which actually reminded me very much of my small town in the Midwest. And I did something as mundane as taking out the trash. It was the fall color change, and I decided to take out the trash and take a stroll. I went out of the building, turned the corner, and the next thing I remember was waking up in the ICU 5 days later. It was a beautiful Sunday to take a stroll and then perhaps go back inside and watch the New England Patriots. And what had happened is that a 1,000-pound tree limb, a 1,000-pound tree limb struck me as I took out the trash and the last night's pizza box and left me unconscious in the driveway with a broken C7 vertebra and a boatload of other injuries. Wow.
So then what happened in your recovery, and you had some surgery then, is that right?
Yes. My C7 vertebra was fractured and neurosurgery was imminent, with a prognosis not knowing, if I would fully recover or only partially. But a week and a half after the accident, I underwent neurosurgery, and then I was introduced to my companion for the next 5 to 6 months. And that companion was a Miami JTO brace. Now,
what's that?
Everyone says, isn't that ironic that you were wearing a Miami article since you were living in South Florida, but the accident happened in New York? And, well, I think it's kind of ironic, but also it sounds like it's a sexy sports car that I'd be driving on South Beach, not a full neck, torso, collar, and back brace called a Miami JTO. And it isn't sexy, and it wasn't fast or sporty. It was exactly the opposite. Yeah. It was a torturous cage, if you will, that kept me immobile so that my bone could fuse, and that now I can say I can go and do adventures.
Could you travel with that? I mean, it sounded like you were pretty limited after that for many months because of that brace. Is that true?
I was under travel restrictions, so there wasn't going to be an airplane ride or train ride home. I was going to recover living in the Northeast. The brace was very limiting. It was uncomfortable to sit in a car. It was uncomfortable to really sit or lie. It puts you in a position that you're probably familiar with when you ride in that uncomfortable row next to the bathrooms in the airplanes, that the seat does not recline and that you are in that forced upright lock position. That was me for 5.5 months.
Wow.
And no showers, mind you. And that was a very hard blow to the ego. Everyone says, how could showers be that big of a deal? It is. When you're in your mid-30s and getting a sponge bath in not the way that you envisioned them, but by a nurse or your mother, it was a challenge, if you will.
What happened with the rest of your life? Because if it was 7 months, a lot got placed on hold. When you're a woman who's been flying, or literally flying around the world, all of a sudden you're 7 months out of commission. What happened?
Well, that old adage of bad things happen in threes, well, that also was the case in my life, and that tree had a ripple effect that didn't only cause physical loss and trauma, but also that high-powered career, they needed to move on with their initiatives, and they weren't going to wait 7 months or 9 months for someone to recover. So I received the news that I was going to be forced to resign from that job, and that professional part of my life was part of my identity. But the hardest blow was that I found out that my marriage had disintegrated even before the tree hit. Just the day before, I had entered into knowing that my husband had been living a double life for nearly a year before all this happened. So in simultaneous collisions, all these losses happened, and I felt that I had lost everything that I held dear that fall. It was the opportunity to have everything on pause that was, I would say, the gift of this tragic event, was that any one of those things alone, with everything else continuing, maybe would have been a little too much clutter to really pay attention and reflect on the opportunity. But because everything.
What tools did you use to get past this once you began to settle with it? How did you begin to fight your way out of it?
Well, after having quite a few pity parties, and I would also say adult temper tantrums, because I can't say that I had this happen and poof, I was able to deal with it. I had to grieve and vent. But once I started to rekindle my power to tap into perspective and understand that I had a choice, not necessarily about what happened to me, but how I would frame it. And I started to think about how this could change my life, chart my course in a different way. And I did have an opportunity to rebuild that former life, but given 9 months to reflect, I decided to architect a new one, a better one, in fact.
You said something I think very important, and that is you began to develop a different perspective. You began to kind of get out of your own box, as it were, and look at yourself from a distance. Over on our side of the business, we call it metacognition. You were thinking about the way you were thinking. And so what happens, you began to look at yourself, and somewhere in there is where the transformational process began. Could you highlight a little bit more about how that began to take place in your own mind and your own self-observations?
I actually created a mantra for my process, and it was a way for me to shift my perspective in just a moment. And it's called Look Up, and it has a double meaning to it. And you already know the backstory that if I was looking up, I may have seen 1,000-pound tree limb coming down. So there's a little comedy in this mantra, but it's one to remind you to look up, to be aware, to be in the moment. So maybe not juggling all those balls or reacting to everything, but just being mindful. And then that second component of look up that I use is to spin each situation positively. So I had 3 different things that necessarily were not positive, but they were opportunities. They also, some caused wounds, but in the end, they created a very interesting type of wisdom that I hope resonates with your listeners.
So what would you say in closing would be, we're going to have all your links to your website, your books, and so on up there, but do you have any special places that are important to you, or books that are important to you that you think you'd want to share with the audience here that would be helpful to them in their own crisis wherever they are?
The reason why that I share my story is because I don't necessarily know what is going to be the secret recipe for somebody else, but I know that you can overcome life's obstacles, whatever it may be, 1,000-pound tree limb, a failed marriage or other, and you can thrive in spite of them. And I want people to know that they have that power.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi, for coming out this afternoon and down there in Florida. You know, it's funny about these Skype meetings. You can be just anywhere in the world. We just talked to somebody earlier who was in the Netherlands, and it's fun connecting with individuals who are on the same path. And we are definitely on the same path, Heidi, and I really appreciate your taking the time, because it's a service for you to share this experience and give some hope to people and give some direction to people who themselves are lost out there. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. And they need a little metaphoric back rub, even, over a podcast. It can be helpful, because then they can start to think, hey, maybe I can do it. This person had this experience and she's pulled it out. So we encourage the people who are listening, who have a curiosity about your story, to read the book. I mean, read both books. It sounds like you have one which is trauma and another was how you recover. And they sound like they're tied up as a package in a way.
They certainly are, and it all has to do with seeing the upside, and all that has to do with is perspective, and you have the power to flip that switch.
Well, thanks so much, Heidi, for sharing that with us. We do have the power if we go ahead and flip it. That's the truth. Seeing reality in a different way is what we're talking about. So